There's a lot of different ways to control weeds in your garden, and using a tiller is one of my favorites. I try and set my rows really wide in the garden, especially down my corn and my beans and my peas and my potatoes, so when it's time to control weeds I can just run that tiller up and down those rows and take care of those weeds, and it just saves a lot of time and makes things easy. What's interesting about using a tiller is as you cultivate that soil, it kind of brings the moisture up to the surface as well too. So sometimes that moisture is down deeper, and as you run that tiller through, it kind of brings the moisture up to the surface, makes the soil look really nice and fluffy and light, and just really keeps those weeds down. There's a lot of different hoes that you can use too, and I'm not averse to using a good old traditional hoe. And traditional hoe like this, just sharpen the edge so you can get a good cut on the weeds. But this just seems like a lot of work to me because you can only just cut in one direction on those weeds. So I love using what's called a stirrup hoe. And stirrup hoe, you can cut in both directions. So this blade moves back and forth and is sharp on both ends, and so you can cut in a pushing motion and you can cut in a pulling motion, and it just makes taking care of weeds so easy to do. So if you got a couple weeds right there, you can push it forward or pull it back and cut those weeds off. So your motion of hoeing is much more simple, and it cuts the weeds off right where the roots are attached into the soil, and then you don't have the weeds growing back nearly as quickly. So with a hoe like this, you know, I can keep my 5,000 square foot garden fairly weed controlled for most of the summer with just a half an hour here and a half an hour there of just using my stirrup hoe, because it works so easy. I can go up and down the rows where I can't get my tiller and get in between plants with this, cut those weeds off. Just makes life so much easier. Another great way to really control weeds in your garden is to use a mulch. So we've got a decorative mulch of soil pep down here. The soil pep blocks the weeds from germinating and coming up, so you won't have nearly as much weed germination. I mean, you'll have some weeds coming up in there, but not nearly as many weeds coming up in a mulch like this, but also helps the soil retain the moisture. So as you water, the water will penetrate down through the mulch, saturate the soil, and then the mulch reflects all the sunlight off, and so it helps keep the soil moist, prevents those weeds from coming up. Very easy way to prevent those weeds from coming up in around, you know, individual plants. Works great for tomatoes, squashes, peppers, things like that. Just saves a lot of work. Very easy to do, and it also looks really nice too out in the garden, and it smells good as well. Probably my favorite way to really control weeds is with a pre-emergent. Now we've got two different, actually the same pre-emergent here, comes in a liquid form as well as in a granule. Now the great thing about this particular product, it's called Treflan, is it will stop weeds from coming up for about 6 to 8 weeks, but it won't affect anything that's there already. So right here I've got a whole bunch of kale coming up, and I've been waiting for the kale to get up and get established before I pull all the weeds out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to water the kale so the soil's nice and moist. I can get in there, I can pull all these small weeds out very easily. But then, now that the kale is up and is germinated and is already growing and has got a root system and is established, I can take my Treflan granules, which is the same thing as preen. It's just the generic form of preen. After I get all these weeds out of the kale here, I can put my Treflan down, and I'll put it right in between the plants and just sprinkle it through here, and it will stop new weeds from coming up, but it won't affect anything that's there already. So it won't bother my existing kale, but it will stop all these new weeds that will want to come up in the kale. Since I use soaker hoses, this soaker hose right here, to water my garden, I only get weeds in about this much area, and then my rows are wide enough I can run the tiller up and down in between the rows. So really I only have to weed this area right here. But if I use the Treflan right in the middle of those plants for about 2 months, this is going to prevent all those weeds as they germinate. I'll maybe get a weed here and a weed there, but nothing like what's come up right now. And this will prevent those weeds from coming up. Personally, I prefer to use, this is a granule. Personally, I prefer to use the liquid because I can mix it up in my tank sprayer. So easy and so simple to make this application. I've got my sprayer on my my tank sprayer set, so it'll just cover about a 12-inch wide area, and I can just take it and just spray right down the rows. It takes me 5 minutes to do a good portion of my garden with a product like this to prevent those weeds from coming up. So it won't kill anything that's there already. It's safe to use in and around a lot of vegetables and fruits as well, and it will stop weeds as they germinate before they get coming up, but it won't affect the existing plants. So between fingers and hose and tillers and a few really neat products to prevent weeds from coming up, you can save yourself a lot of work in the garden and stop weeds before they get going.